hope you're doing well. I know it's been a little while since I recorded. It's been a crazy couple weeks. My wife and I are in the process of moving. You can kind of see that behind me. I'm not in my normal setup, so it's been a little bit more difficult than what I would like for recording. But anyway, I've been able to get back to my reading, and I've got some good topics lined up. Today it's actually a really beautiful day in Oregon. It's a little cool, but it's really beautiful outside. And today I'm drinking a Long Miles Lunar Station from Onyx, and it's got some really interesting flavors that, it says rose, cranberry, and milk chocolate, but I'm not sure if I believe all of those. Maybe it's just a little bit too hot, but I can definitely taste some of the plum. So today we're going to talk about the mess known as abundance, which is written by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, published in March of 2025. The main reason why I decided that I wanted to talk about this book is because I saw the disaster of a discussion between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and just felt like I needed to talk about them in some manner, and kind of like the limitations of these two authors and their ability of imagining a future. And a lot of that is because these guys, both sides, basically every issue that they talk about, they talk about how the left wants this and the right wants this, but they don't even really notice the asymmetry between what the left is asking for, which is just like decency and human rights, and what the right is asking for, which is like mass deportations. These are just not equivocal, but they're acting as if they are, which I think is a big problem with punditry in the United States right now, where pronouns is treated equivalently as wanting to, hundreds of thousands of people, potentially millions of people. So when they aren't really doing that, they're just attacking policies on the left, claiming they aren't really, that these are really what's slowing down building things. Those environmental impacts are well intentioned, but they're really slowing things down. We need to build. I've done some thinking in the past about why America doesn't build anymore or build as much, and I think that a lot of pundits and leaders point to various causes, including we have too many regulations, which I actually kind of say bullshit on that. Because I really found through a lot of the reading that I've done that regulations spur innovation, and dropping things that we agreed we need as a society isn't always the right answer. I mean, there's a reason why we want environmental impact studies. Now, could those be streamlined or made a little bit more easier to access? Sure. Is some of it potentially exploitative? Possibly. I mean, so for my house, since we're putting it up for sale, we had to put in some environmental measurements or statement together for our house. And my realtor was like, this is total hogwash, it's just a way to make money and blah, blah, blah. Which maybe it is a way to get some extra money out of people selling their house, but it's also important because people should know how environmentally, how much energy their house is going to consume. I mean, this is a big house. Is it going to be well worth the expense? And I think that's something that we should do. It's just frustrating whenever your realtor doesn't have you do it right at the beginning or doesn't tell you about it, and you find out as oh, by the way, here's a $500 fine for not having done this. And that's a problem. If if that is something that is actively done as part of the real estate process, I think that it can really show value to customers, because people will want to know if they actually need to go in and put in new insulation or not. Thomas and Klein argue that having minority and women-owned businesses required in the construction process are needlessly impeding building and driving up costs. They are looking at this from the end result rather than kind of looking at it as an entire process. We can either have incentives that drive more people into the process, or we can continue to have the process dominated by a specific class of people. What we probably need to be understanding is, why are they not entering this space? Why are they dropping out of working in this space? And trying to look at the incentives as to what we can do to keep them in the space. I think part of the challenge is that the limitation is actually like small businesses are considered less than $1 million a year, which for San Francisco, which is specifically the area that they're talking about and the things that they're saying we need to address, that probably is a little bit low. That's only just renovating a couple houses per year, which isn't really enough to keep a business going. So I think that what we need to look at for that is saying, okay, this number is too low. We need to up this to 5 or 10 million to be considered a small business, because of the cost of the market, because studies have shown that middle class life in the Bay Area is like, you need 100,000. I just saw a Substack where a guy was basically arguing that the middle class for a family of 4 is actually 130,000, or the poverty line ought to be at, based off of the historical calculation of it. So whenever you start thinking of things in that context, you're only talking about, without any sort of material costs, $1 million is only 8 employees, and especially in the Bay Area, that is not really a whole lot of employees. And even if you're dropping that price down, you got to look at, is that reasonable? How can this even exist as a business with this? So I think that the first thing isn't get rid of that thing, is to look at how can we expand this, or have we artificially limited this so we basically need to keep having new businesses start all the time. And if it's starting new businesses all the time, that might not be sustainable. And maybe we need to find a middle ground where it's saying, go from $1 million to 5 million, see how that changes the process, see if that makes things easier. Because if companies are successful, they're going to quickly find themselves like earning out of this position, of this role. And if that's the reason why we're losing people or dropping out of the space, that's a problem, especially if we go from them having business, they hit $1 million, and then suddenly they're out of it, and then they don't get any more business until the next year. That's a problem, because those people are going to go out of business, because they're not expected to really, you can't expect to work in that environment. Women and minority in engineering is a particular issue generally that companies want to solve by claiming it's a pipeline issue. There's a lot more that's going on, in my opinion, and from my experience. It's not that women aren't interested in these things. It's that women are often sexually harassed out of the sciences. If you look at the book Disordered Cosmos by Chanda Prescott Weinstein, who writes extensively about the racism and sexual harassment that she experiences as a queer Jewish woman of color, she's the type of people we want to stay in science, because she's passionate about science. She's a person of color. She's a multiple, a religious minority, a queer person. That is someone that we would ostensibly want to be included in the future of science and academia and all of that. Our institutions failed her. The places that she worked failed her. And even NASA has failed her in terms of rewarding James Webb, who was historically a bigot and a homophobe, by naming our latest, greatest satellite off of him, which means Prescott Weinstein, who is an astrophysicist, every time she looks at any data related to tests that she's conducting, it's coming from a place from James Webb. Everything is coming from this misogynist homophobe. And that is problematic from a perspective of feeling inclusive for the sciences. So if we don't have enough women-owned construction companies, we need to ask why. Why aren't they getting the experience they need to start a construction company? What's happening to women who are working for a construction company so that they never get to that point? What can we do to address the root cause of that? How can we incentivize more women to start these businesses? There's quite a lot there that we can address before we just toss up our hands and say, oh, well, this is a problem and it's impeding building and driving up costs. What is the source of the limitation? That's something we can address in a different way. I also want to focus on their innovation and invention section. First, I want to start out by explaining my frustration with this. They do not include any discussions about austerity or sequestration in this section at all. If you remember or don't remember, in the 2010s, there was a huge debate around the national, like the NSF and National Science Foundation and other sorts of research institutes, including just funding academia, that Paul Ryan led in the 2010s fighting against Obama, called sequestration, where they just want to sequester, keep all the money away from going to academia. And at the time, people were talking about the impact of sequestration would be turning back, slowing academic research for 30 years. And I know this because it personally affected my wife. At the time, she was finishing up her postdoc and trying to figure out the next steps in her academic career. She was looking for another postdoc opportunity. She was looking for potentially a full professorship, kind of figuring out where she wanted to go. But because of the drop in the amount of funding that was available, there were fewer and fewer jobs available for her. So she had no choice but to drop out of academia and to take an academic job or an industry job. And I know she would have been happy staying in academia. I know there's challenges to that, but that was kind of the first thing that she wanted to do. She kind of took the industry route only because that was the only option left for her. I mean, with all the government shutdowns that we've been seeing more and more frequently happening, and with everything that's happening on the Trump administration right now, that was being telegraphed from the 2025 project. There's no discussion about any of this. This is really a discussion based off of assumption that Biden would have won again, or Kamala Harris would have won, or somebody in the Democratic Party would have won. But there's not anything about here's what we need to do to improve things. And I think that they are accepting a lot of right-wing talking points just as a given. Like sequestration, since they aren't contesting it, they're essentially accepting it. Same with austerity. They mentioned an award that was given called the Golden Fleece Award in the 70s and 80s, and just accepted it, that it was a credible political weapon without any real complaints about it. And they said that it was a good thing that the NIH responded to this. The Golden Fleece Award was bullshit. And it was, if you look up the actual things that won the award, I'll link a couple here. many of them actually resulted in good things. And I think in a similar way, it's like the Republicans attacking shrimp on a treadmill.
This current fight could cost us. And let's start with the fact that conservatives' distrust of education is nothing new. Nixon famously said the professors are the enemy. And historically, their attacks have fallen into a few key categories. One big one has been that universities are wasting taxpayer money on things like frivolous scientific research. Fox has been talking about one example in particular for literally years now.
$503,000 to watch shrimp on a treadmill.
I mean, yeah, it is hard to forget, partly because you won't shut the fuck up about it, and partly because it's inherently great TV. Honestly, that story won't go away. Just this year, Joni Ernst complained we put shrimp on a treadmill to see how fast they run. And that research was actually useful. A marine biologist and his colleagues were studying how changes in the oceans could potentially affect the ability of marine organisms to fight infections. And for what it's worth, the treadmill in that video actually cost less than $50 and was paid for out of the researcher's own pocket.
It's used to show that scientists are frivolous and basic research is disconnected from reality. You can't even, it's not even in the same league as putting funding towards, initiatives to reduce impact of dirty coal or something like that. These things are not frivolous, and a lot of times that we don't really understand what we're going to get out of basic research. So, for example, one of the things that has led to a big boon in medical science at this time came from a very unexpected source. Gila monster saliva was started to be researched because the Gila monster has a specific property where it is able to regulate its own hunger, and it can go a very long time without needing to eat anything. And so people were looking at this to see, well, how does it do this? What does the impact of this saliva do, and how can we understand more about it? And that eventually resulted in an entire class of drugs called GLP-1, which is turning out to be a fucking miracle drug. It was originally intended to help with diabetes. It helps with diet. It shows an inflammatory response improvement. It's being tested for long COVID, the one that I'm on right now, which I'm using for multiple chemical sensitivities, is being shown to reduce long COVID symptoms. There is a whole class of things that we're uncovering because of this, because someone decided to research what Gila monster saliva could do. I think in a lot of ways that could have been pulled into the golden fleece. It's like, oh, they're off researching saliva from the Gila monster. Like, what is some lizard spit going to do? You could easily see how that could be manipulated into something that would be considered non-valuable as a scientific research. These guys have done some research into innovation. And in fact, they read one of my favorite kind of innovation books. I read it during my master's thesis called The Innovation Factory, which is a history of Bell Labs. There's a whole class in these books. It's kind of the history of these research institutions. The most popular one, I would argue, is probably Skunk Works. Everybody's kind of heard about that. It's the Lockheed Martin, and resulted in the Blackbird and Stealth Bomber and some of those other sorts of spy planes. Bell Labs is one for AT&T, and they argued that because they had monopoly pricing, they could blow a whole bunch of money on research. I don't really understand how they got to that understanding, because they had a mantra that was always better, faster, cheaper. That was anything that they were working on had to in some way result into things being better, faster, cheaper in the long run. And they created the transistor out of this. They actually came out with 2 versions of it within like 2 years of it in the 50s. And the reason for this is because they knew that vacuum tubes, which was the alternative to a transistor, was bulky, huge, expensive to make, fragile, and so they needed to make something that could be smaller, faster, and more mass produced. Replacing the vacuum tube was always high on everybody's list. Everybody knew that. So there was a lot of activity going on trying to replace it and turning that into what we now know as the transistor. And the company, the reason why the company actually shared the results, which is kind of where you could say that they, because they had the monopoly pricing, they could really just give away the research. This was a tactic. The AT&T was constantly being put in crosshairs for antitrust action. And AT&T Bell Labs continually come back to the Department of Defense and say, hey, you need a radar because the Soviets have come up with a new spy plane. We're actively working on that. Look at what this is. We'll give you the patent for that if you... And the Defense Department would work with the DOJ to say, hey, we're not ready to break them up yet. So in that regard, you could say the AT&T was really savvy with what they were doing with Bell Labs to use it as a mechanism to protect monopoly profits and pricing, even though they were trying to reduce pricing. Because there is some evidence that immediately after, some pricing did go up, and that was because some of the pricing in some ways were artificially kept low. And some of it was also other companies needed to build out their infrastructure. And this is something that's extremely explicit in the book. And the fact that they don't talk about this at all means that they really missed a lot of the book. Like the author of the book, I'll show it here, I forget his name right now, really argues that is what prevented the antitrust activity against them and what pushed it to the 80s for this process. And it was only whenever there was so much national pressure that it was unavoidable that the antitrust action went forward. And every time you hear about, if you talk about some of the enshittification or the internet con where Cory Doctorow talked about the AT&T breakup and was like, it took forever, it eventually worked, but it took forever. This is one of the main reasons why, or at least an argument for why this could have happened. It may not have been the only reason, but certainly delivering on what the U.S. government needed for the Cold War certainly seems like a solid reason to keep a major institution with a major research institution together. And I think that for our generation, or my generation, coming up with Google getting popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, and them kind of being this benevolent company was kind of the AT&T of my generation. They had great policies around innovation. They really encouraged new things. They would push out all these new products, and they had the 20% rule, and they had people just saying, oh, I want to build maps, and so they built maps, and then they figured out how to monetize it later. And I think it's obvious how corrupt the organization has been with the way that it's being exploited. The ads, that's the pure enshittification, and it had to figure out a business model, and once it did, it was a hard pivot to that. And once the original founders were out, it became purely about money and revenue. Now it's the largest advertising company in the world, and it has memes about all the dead products, and I feel that it's becoming tighter and tighter focused on a certain number of things, and I expect that we're going to get less and less innovation out of them. You hardly hear about X Labs or the Google Moonshot stuff anymore, even though that was kind of like the biggest thing that was kind of out there. And I thought that there was really good opportunities with that, including the challenges around that to try and get people invested. And this isn't even really something that these guys talk about much. And I think that there's a big difference with Google and AT&T. AT&T made physical things, so you kind of had to have a purchaser for those things, and you needed to be able to have someone who would be able to absorb the initial high cost to get it out into a place that the consumer market could get it, and that was the DoD in this case. And with Google, you could get early adopters, and you could you could afford using the billions of dollars that you got from the investors and shareholders to kind of wait until you got the profit, and now you have the revenue of ads to be able to kind of test everything out. So one of the things that I learned while earning my master's degree was about different approaches to spurring innovation. And at my university, there was a big push towards something called strategic niche management. And without really knowing anything about it, since they didn't really do any research beyond just reading the Innovation Factory, Thompson and Klein actually stumble upon this approach in their own way. It's not really picking winners. It is leaving the opportunity open for a lot of competitors and providing a way for them to take risk because there's a market failure. There's always a market failure at the beginning of new technologies and new platforms because there's not enough money, especially for hardware things and physical things at this point. There's not enough money to get a lot of that manufacturing off the ground. There's investors are really focused on one thing right now, which is AI, and that's kind of creating problems for a lot of these startup companies that want to build things. And so you can either have governments provide grants, you can offer to have the government buy technology and set options with targets to say that the product has to meet certain performance needs, especially if it's for energy or energy generation or whatever. That can really drive the success. Thompson and Klein claim there's too much focus on the Eureka myth, which is another way of saying great man of history, which there are plenty of mechanisms to analyze history to avoid the great man of history. Network actor theory is one, or actor network theory is one, another one I learned in school, which looked at the specific interactions of different people in organizations during some critical time period to determine how the whole system ultimately led to some specific outcome. Bell Labs itself was successful because the continual turnover of people in the company and the demands of the DoD. Xerox PARC is another example of that, where they were constantly being pushed to come up with new ideas. Kodak was a similar research organization. All these organizations bet broadly and invested in a number of technologies. They were building physical things, though. This means there are significant trade-offs between taking one product to market over another product to market. In the case of the AT&T, the product had clear goals, which is why Bell Labs was successful. Xerox had significantly less clear goals, and that's why Apple scooped their key design, the GUI. The problem with strategic niche management in the U.S. is the Solyndra example. This was railed on so hard by Republicans during the Obama years that I think it actually set back this sort of innovation management approach for our country quite a bit. So the Obama years offered loan guarantees to a number of companies. So basically, if you were successful, you had to pay back the loan. If you weren't successful, the loan got paid back. The government paid the loan back. And in the case of Solyndra, which was a novel idea for producing energy. It was relatively promising, and it was a way of using solar panels that could have paved the way for the U.S. to dominate a new solar market. And when this company failed, it was a huge issue. The Republicans used it as a way to drive further austerity measures and argue that the government shouldn't be picking winners. This is one of the cases that I'm sure Thompson and Klein were thinking about when they wrote those words. They just skated over this, though, and I think that's a real problem, because if you want to have a new market get created, a safe way to do that, to encourage innovation or entrepreneurship, is to give them a safety net, is to say, here's a bunch of money, and we're going to offer, here's awards, or here's a way that you can try and get money, and then after you reach certain goals, you can apply for larger grants, and then once it reaches a certain size that it becomes interesting for VC funding, then that's whenever the VC markets can take over, and that's whenever the government can start recouping its money, or they can say, we're going to wait until you go public, and then you have to pay us back with this sort of interest rate. There's a lot of ways that can happen at that point, but the Republicans pushed the fact that Obama picked this as a winner, and that we shouldn't be picking winners. And I mean, the government shouldn't be picking winners. They should be saying, here's a lot of options. Let's see how successful these products are and what they're trying to do in the market, and if the market accepts any of it. So I really think that the authors really both sides these issues when there's a clear reason. The Republicans are anti-science and anti-technology. And if you invest in science and it tells you something you don't want to hear, you either need to discredit that thing or you need to do something about it. The Republicans have decided to discredit science rather than doing something about climate change, rising sea levels, health issues caused by factories, etc. The two sides in this are not equal. The left, I would argue, hasn't taken a strong enough stance on any of these things. The right has. It's built an entire movement on anti-intellectualism and anti-science. Just look at the last book I reviewed, which was Against the Machine. The author states that science is one of the four major problems we have in our society. So I hope that Thompson and Klein are looking at what the Trump administration is doing with the things they're calling crises and emergencies. The authors argue that we should take more advantage of emergencies and crises to build things faster. I think that there are some issues with that approach. Some rules could be relaxed, sure, but abandoning those changes to slam through those policies and rules and regulations, to slam through some changes without regard for the community around them, is what got us into a lot of these problems in the first place. I mean, look at redlining and look at how interstates were intentionally put through neighborhoods of people of color to destroy those communities. You don't want to do that again. We need to have learned from that. If you're willing to say that demonizing immigrants with a transparent, Thompson and Klein have accepted that immigrants are part of the reason why there's a housing stock shortage. This is fundamentally not true. There is not enough houses being made, and the houses that are on the market are often being bought by companies like Blackstone. Thompson and Klein don't talk about that, which is a problem, and trying to just say we got to get rid of these regulations to build stuff, you're missing something that could be done to address the part of the market. I don't think that the cost of housing was the real point, though. It never really was. Thompson and Klein are naive for taking anything J.D. Vance says about immigrants in good faith. J.D. Vance is a fascist. He literally just defended 30-year-old men, so they said they look Hitler by saying kids say stupid things. White people get to be kids into their 30s. That's insane. These guys need to take a serious look at what they actually believe, because they don't seem to believe in anything truly. They will drop any and every liberal policy to build more houses without understanding ways that we can materially improve things. We have to try to right historic wrongs, and that should be not swept under the rug because things are hard. We need to create solutions within the context of fixing the wrongs and building a better future. One of the ways of doing that is to stop both sizing things when things are very different between the left and the right, where it's yes, actually I want minorities to be able to start companies versus immigrants are bad because they drive up the housing costs. Those are just, one's a talking point from is a fascist talking point. It's the sort of thing that Curtis Yarvin spouts, and it is a slippery slope towards Nazism. So I'm going to leave things there at this point. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate that you came back to watch this video. And I really hope you have a good day. Could you give me a comment? Have you read Abundance? What do you think about it? Do you think I focused on the wrong aspect? Do you think I'm talking about my ass? Please comment, like, subscribe, and thanks again.